Last week saw the release of Captain America Brave New World, the first Captain America movie featuring Sam Wilson as Captain America. The film's title, an obvious allusion to the famous novel by Aldous Huxley, promised something novel and interesting, while the film itself was anything but. The film was a lame reheat of earlier Captain America movies. There was an introductory hostage rescue sequence that revealed a sinister conspiracy. There was an ambush in the middle of a street by an international assassin. There was a military base in the middle of nowhere with a basement that has the villain from an earlier Marvel film who's undergone a serious physical transformation. Hell, there's an American super soldier who's been brainwashed and turned into an assassin. There was even a beloved, iconic new Hollywood actor starring as the villain. To put it simply, Brave New World feels like somebody was trying to draw the Winter Soldier from memory in the dark with crayons. And that's not the only aspect of the movie that feels like a throwback. The emotional core of Brave New World hinges on the relationship between Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross and Betty Ross, two characters who have not appeared together on screen since The Incredible Hulk 17 years ago. Liv Tyler hasn't appeared in an MCU project since, and Harrison Ford is a recast for the late great William Hurt, meaning the emotional core of this movie is a 30-second reunion between two actors who never appeared together on screen before, and two characters who haven't been seen together since 2008. The plot also hinges on a dangling plot thread from Eternals, the worst reviewed Marvel Studios project to that point, because of course it does. All of this creates a strong sense that Brave New World is anything but. It is instead a movie that is looking backwards. Rather than gesturing to the future, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become lost in its own past. So this week, we're going to talk about how Marvel Studios gave up on the future. Think less Brave New World and more same old nonsense. One of the early defining traits of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for better and for worse, were the post-credits stingers. Starting with Iron Man in 2008, at the end of each movie, a character would show up and promise the audience that something interesting was coming down the track. Nick Fury shows up teasing the Avengers.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Tony Stark shows up to prove these movies are all connected. Coulson finds Thor's hammer in New Mexico. There was a clear sense of forward momentum propelling these movies. In some ways, this was a clever way of mitigating any flaws with the individual films. If the audience wasn't happy, for example, with Iron Man 2, don't worry. Thor was coming next summer and we'll get that right, we promise. There is a valid debate to be had about that, but at the very least there was a clear sense of movement in a forward direction. It isn't that these early movies didn't make missteps or mistakes. They famously, for example, had to retcon the inclusion of the Infinity Gauntlet in both Thor and Age of Ultron. And it is admittedly hard to square where Tony Stark ends Iron Man 3 with where he starts Age of Ultron. But, generally speaking, there was a sense that these movies were going somewhere, and that crucially the audience could go along with these characters. It was also easy enough to follow. Across the 22 films leading up to Endgame, Tony Stark featured in 10 of those, and was the lead in at least 8. Steve Rogers appeared in 9, and was the lead in 7. So it was quite easy to see, just based on the numbers, who the leads of this epic saga were, and it was generally quite easy to follow these characters through a trilogy of solo movies and into the big Avengers crossovers. It was all propulsive. It was all built around the promise of the next thing. While the specifics of the next thing weren't ever really nailed down, it was always at least clear what that next thing was. Thanos, for example, didn't really get any character development or motivation until Infinity War, but the audience still knew that he was coming since at least the Avengers. The nature of the tension between Cap and Iron Man might have shifted over the course of the movies, but it was always about the push and pull and the promise of reconciliation between them that drove these movies. Since Endgame, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has lost that sense of propulsive forward momentum. Some of that is a result of unforeseeable and unpredictable events, such as the tragic death of Chadwick Boseman derailing the Black Panther franchise, or the conviction of Jonathan Majors for domestic violence. However, the problem is more widespread and more fundamental than any of that. In fact, it's notable that Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, the movie motivated by the tragic death of Boseman, is easily one of the more successful post-Endgame Marvel projects. In the 11 years and 22 movies between Iron Man and Endgame, Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor each had their own trilogy of movies and starred in 4 Avengers films. These characters were built up gradually, but with commitment. There was an expectation that, if the studio committed to these characters, audiences would follow along. The studio didn't derail its investment in these heroes in response to poor critical reception to, say, Iron Man 2 or Thor: The Dark World, because it believed that these characters could build to more. Or that these characters could build to Thor. To put it simply, Marvel invested in the present because they believed in the future. It is clear that Marvel has been in something of an existential crisis since Endgame. The first movie of Phase 4 wasn't anything bold or new that pushed the franchise forward. It was instead Black Widow, a prequel that was built around a character who had been killed off in Endgame. Throughout Phase 4, there was always this interesting tension between the studio's desire to introduce new characters and to hold on to nostalgia for its own past. So, new characters like Yelena or Ironheart could be introduced, but in movies that focused on existing properties. Existing mantles could be passed down to new characters like Jane Foster as Thor, but the movie had to go out of its way to assure audiences that Chris Hemsworth wasn't going anywhere.
Just checking.
Movies like Spider-Man: No Way Home and Deadpool and Wolverine were crammed full of nostalgia for dead universes and previous iterations of existing characters. As such, these movies featured a lot of remember when. Even when new heroes were introduced, like say Kate Bishop or Moon Knight or Miss Marvel, it was often on streaming, which had the effect of making these characters seem less important and more skippable. All of this made it very difficult to invest in these characters as the future of the MCU. Hell, even in the rare case where new characters were established reasonably successfully, as with Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, there was no attempt to capitalize on that success by directly following up on it. Iron Man and Captain America completed trilogies within 5 years of their cinematic debut. Thor, on the other hand, was a little bit sluggish. It took him a total of 6 years. Even the 4 Avengers movies, which were, frankly, momentous production undertakings, all came together within a total of 7 years. In contrast, it has now been 6 years since Endgame, and Marvel Studios has yet to produce a single sequel to any of the movies that it has released in that period. Even factoring in the streaming shows, Loki and Sam Wilson are the only characters to get to lead more than a single project within that period. There is no sense of forward momentum. There is no sense of promise. There is no sense of a future. There is no feeling that the company has established a foundation upon which it hopes and plans to build. Hell, you can see this even looking at the recent post-credit scenes, which are less built around assuring the audience that something interesting is going to happen, and more about boasting that the company has somehow managed to sign a big-name actor to play maybe a C-list character in a sequel that may or may not get made in the next decade. While there was a tension within Phase 4 between the past and the future, with stories often finding younger and older heroes thrown into contrast with one another, teasing the possibility of a new generation emerging from the shadows, it's become clear in Phase 5 that Marvel has abandoned even the vaguest gesture towards a future where it moves past its original brand of heroes. Throughout these movies and shows, Marvel spent a great deal of energy teasing characters who might go on to be part of the Young Avengers, a new generation of heroes. Characters like Hawkeye, Wiccan, Miss Marvel. It's very telling that Brave New World was intended to feature one such young character, Elijah Bradley, but he was cut from the movie. Hell, as we were doing post-production on this video, it was announced that Marvel had scrapped plans for a series based around the character of Nova, the superhero alter ego of Richard Dick Rider. Movies like Brave New World and Thunderbolts don't feel like the future of Marvel Studios. Instead, they feel like contractual obligations, movies greenlit in the post-orgasmic haze of the early response to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier that are now just ways to tidy away past continuity so the studio can push towards the big Avengers crossover of Doomsday and Secret Wars. The studio is entering those crossovers without any clearly defined leads. Marvel has not invested the time or the energy to build up any next-generation protagonists to fill the narrative vacuum left by Iron Man or Captain America or, hell, even Thor. It's been too busy indulging in nostalgia, so of course the studio is bringing back Robert Downey Jr. Of course the studio has hired Chris Evans again. Of course the studio has brought back the Russo brothers. There's a palpable sense of, let's just get this over with so we can soft reboot the universe and reintroduce established and well-worn cinematic brands like Fantastic Four and X-Men. I'm sure it'll work for us this time. It's also worth noting that every tease of the upcoming Marvel X-Men franchise has hinged on nostalgia for earlier adaptations, whether actors reprising existing roles or simply reviving an old animated series. So even when Marvel does gesture towards the idea of a future, It's harking back to the past. There was a time when audiences looked forward to the next Marvel Studios project. Now, the studio itself just looks backwards. I've been Darren Mooney. This was The Backdrop.